Okay. Okay, and we are live. Welcome to Nerd Church, the place where Katie, Amanda, and Aldo get together to talk about the readings in the Catholic lectionary and see what critical scholarship has to say about them, because we understand that reading the Bible as Christians does not mean reading the Bible as idiots. It's also the place where I get to live out the dream of every member of Gen X and have my own cable access show. um, Today we are in the fourth Sunday in Ordinary Time and are continuing our rapid run of the ministry of Jesus. And we also have a good treat for today because we have a reading from the book of Zephaniah, which is one of those prophets that you tell people, oh, I like this passage of Zephaniah, and they say, who? And then we have our psalm is being repeated for the second time. And this is actually the third time that someone who is going to church every Sunday will have heard this particular section of Matthew 5. So we're starting to see some themes repeated in a really interesting way. So without further ado, we will get started. As always, I will go into screen sharing. Aldo and Amanda will read through the readings. We'll talk about them as a whole and then break down the readings one at a time. So let me get into screen sharing. Okay, so here we go. And okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yes,
Okay, cool. Aldo, you are up.
perfect. So today's reading is from the book of Zephaniah, chapter 2, verse 3, and chapter 3, verses 12 to 13. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the earth, who have observed his law. Seek justice, seek humility. Perhaps you may be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. But I will leave as a remnant in your midst, a people humble and lowly, who shall take refuge in the name of the Lord, the remnant of Israel. They shall do no wrong and speak no lies, nor shall they be found in their mouths a deceitful tongue. They shall pasture and couch their flocks with none to disturb them. And then we jump to Psalm 146, verses 6 through 10. The Lord keeps faith forever, secures justice for the oppressed, gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets captives free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord raises up those who were bowed down. The Lord loves the just. The Lord protects strangers. The fatherless and the widow the Lord sustains. but the way of the wicked he thwarts. The Lord shall reign forever, your God, O Zion, through all generations. Alleluia.
Okay. And now we've got Amanda with Corinthians. I can't hear you at all, Amanda. I don't know what's going on.
Turn on your mic.
Oh, okay. Now we can hear you.
Yay.
Okay.
All right. Consider your own calling, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. Rather, God chose the foolish of the world to shame the wise, and God chose the weak of the world to shame the strong, and God chose the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something, so that no human being might boast before God. It is due to him that you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, as well as righteousness, sanctification, and redemption, so that, as it is written, whoever boasts should boast in the Lord.
Okay. And then we have our gospel.
Me?
Yeah, you.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. He began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven."
Okay. So one thing that I just wanted to point out right away is the way it is just that the way that the psalm gives the option of using as the refrain, so the response that the congregation is reciting, as being Matthew 5:3. So I'm pointing that out because I think it's a really beautiful illustration of the way that the project of the lectionary is kind of to put all of this to put all of these texts kind of in conversation with each other. So it's almost like you have the author of the psalm is saying, okay, this is what the messianic age looks like. This is what it looks like when God is in charge, as opposed to people who are inclined to mess things up. And you've got Matthew saying, yeah, right on, you got it. And it's kind of an interesting project. And again, we have, the salt of the earth language, and then, the sort of remnant language in Zephaniah. And again, kind of this idea of, how poor and lowly and persecuted people don't lose their value. Which I think is something that is a really important part, just kind of throughout time, of what's in the New Testament, is this sort of insistence that even people who don't have wealth and don't have power and don't have social status still retain inherent value as simply because they're humans. which is something that, and I mean, I think that Christians, often will get sort of self-congratulatory about, how, Christianity introduces all these ideas and makes the world a better place and blah, blah, blah. But I do think that this is one area where the ideas that get developed in Christianity really do introduce an idea to the world that makes a big difference. Because if you read Greek philosophy or you read classical authors, it's really obvious that there is this idea that kings are inherently, like, in some cases even physically, biologically different and inherently more valuable than poor people are. And this is saying, no, poor people are valuable, which, is something that is useful to hear, especially since we still live in a world where people want to insist that rich people are rich because they're better.
I mean, I would go as far to say that it's not even that poor people are still have value. It's almost as if are they're God's particular concern.
Yeah.
Like they're the point.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think you could even say that it goes a step further and says poor people are the point. It's not about the rich guy.
The upside down kingdom, as I've heard it called.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the upside down kingdom, the idea that, when it's good for it, and it's just kind of the idea that it's not good unless it's good for everybody. Right? Because making life perfect for like two guys is easy to do, right? Making life good for 200 people or 2 million people or 8 billion people is more of a challenge. Okay, so Aldo, I know, had gotten to dive into the minor prophets this week. So what did you find out?
Okay, so starting with Zephaniah, which may be a kind of an obscure character for us Christians in general. Well, he's not as well known as Isaiah, for example. So he lived in the times of King Josiah, which is around 640 to 609 BCE. And this was just around before really in Josiah's religious reforms. He's famously known in the Book of Chronicles because he asked the Levites to leave the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. And Assyria was still a dominant empire, although it was weakening. So if you remember our past readings from Isaiah, there was this ensuing threat from the Assyrians to turn the kingdom of Judah into a vassal state. So they are still vassals to Assyria, but it is the empire is not as strong as when it was back in Isaiah's time.
And just as a reminder, Josiah is the king of Judah, correct? Or is he the king of Israel?
Yeah, that's correct, because they, when the kingdom of Israel fell, that was around the 700s before the Common Era. Before the Common Era. So this is
so about 100 years before Zephaniah. I'm just making sure that I'm getting the timeline straight in my head.
Correct. And then let's see, where was I? And then, well, this is a critique to, on the one hand, to the royal elite and the priestly elite of the Kingdom of Judah. And we talked back when Dr. Davis was with us during the live stream about the prophetic critique. So if you notice, most of these prophetic books appear during this era where Judah is a vassal state to the Assyrians. And what they are trying to tell the people is that God is there for them and that he will not let, the elites to get away with it. And that is reflected in the sense that where all these readings come from, like referring to the humble of the earth, which are of course not the people from the elite, but they have kept the law. And then and of course he extols the right moral qualities and the right just actions for to tell people that they will be compensated in a spiritual way because of their conduct.
And the prophetic critique is basically where we get the start of all of the anti-empire language in the Bible, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And of course, that's language that, the New Testament is just going to take and run with. As the and as the empire is just you keep getting and you just keep this experience of just more empire and the empires keep getting better at being imperial.
Exactly.
Okay. And did you have anything for us on the psalm?
Sure. So for the psalm, when we get to the Gospels, you will notice that much of the language from the Psalms is repeated in the Sermon of the Mount. So you can actually look at some Bibles, and you will notice that they will reference to the exact psalm and verse, and that is a kind of language that is being repeated. So the author of Matthew, what he's doing is trying to tell people about that, to make that reference for the people who are reading this passage back to the Psalms.
Yeah. And that's why, kind of the traditional and somewhat reductive way of talking about Matthew is as, he's the apostle to the Hebrews, because he's the one who keeps pulling in all these references to the Psalms and to these other biblical books. Even though, as we've already started to talk about, it's a little more complicated than that, because Matthew is pretty clearly not particularly familiar with Hebrew and is pulling and is clearly depending on the Septuagint.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's something that I think we'll get that's something that I think we always need to keep an eye on with Matthew. And it's something that we can watch for more kind of as in this year we work through our Matthew.
Correct.
Okay. Well, now we have this section of Corinthians, which I kind of feel like we have to take a second to kind of talk about the fact that a lot of Christian anti-intellectualism has been built on this section of Corinthians. whenever anybody with a sixth grade education decides to open up decides to rent out a storefront and open up a church, which is a familiar sight throughout the Christian world now that Protestants are a thing. They will at some point quote this passage in Corinthians. Because this is we don't need your fancy book learning. All we need is the gospel and the truth of the Lord. And that's not what's going on here. Instead, what this is not saying book learning is bad. This is saying that there are lots of ways to know God, and that, even very ordinary people who have this sort of, just kind of, sort of sincere, naive piety, and they're just, they just want to be nice to people. They go to church, or they're wherever their house of worship is, and they pray, and they're just kind of nice to people, and that's good. And that is, I think, what Paul is saying here, and that's kind of the traditional Catholic way of dealing with this section of Corinthians, is just to say, this is kind of praising the kind of, simple, naive, pure, village piety.
I don't disagree with you.
but
I think it's a lot more about power.
Yes.
Than like the praise of it's going, I mean, because of just the circumstances of the first century, he's, saying that the people everybody else thinks are special are not sort of it. But this actually passage reminds me of something my grandpa used to say to me. So, backstory, my grandpa was a Baptist preacher, and I was very close to him. And in fact, my dad once recently said that I had a special relationship with him out of all the grandchildren, and I thought that as a kid, but I was glad to hear it as an adult. But he used to tell me that God chose his weakest vessels to be preachers. He was talking about himself, because they needed to be closer to God all the time. And so that's what this makes me think of, like this, instead of being so self-assured, it's finding a way to be aware of one's own fallibility or weakness, instead of the intellectualism that I have definitely heard from this passage before interpreted.
Yeah. And I mean, and there's, of course, the, famous quote about, Christianity being a religion for women and slaves, right? And I mean, and I think that because, when we think of early Christianity, a lot of what gets thought of is the writings of the church fathers, right? Because that's what got preserved, is this kind of, the thoughts of this very educated elite, or even, what makes it into the Gospels is the product of those Christians who had at least a little bit of education. And I think this is a good reminder that the bulk of the converts in early Christianity really were like drawn from the lower strata of society. And I think that when we look at this part of Corinthians, it's really easy to see why, because Paul's message was squarely targeted at the people who weren't part of the elite, which of course makes sense when you consider the fact that new religious movements do not typically pick up followers among the elites. And when kings try to start new religious movements, those new religious movements tend not to survive the king's death. You know, whether you're talking about in India, the Emperor Akbar is trying to come up with the Din-i-Ilah, right? The way of God, his like perfect universal religion that everybody was going to like, right? Or when the Pharaoh Akhenaten tries to introduce monotheism, or, you know, actually even later on when the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate tries to de-establish Christianity and bring back Roman paganism in a world where people were actually starting to sincerely be into Christianity. You know, you have those top-down reforms and everybody's like, no, we're not going to do it, right? Whereas religious movements that start from the bottom up, yeah, they may not always succeed, but those bottom up movements are the only ones that ever make it, because the bottom up movements are fulfilling needs that people have, right? Because obviously if you're the Emperor Augustus, you don't need a new religion because your old religion is working just fine.
You're on top of the heap.
Right, you're on top of the heap. If you are a, you know, if you're a Jew living in a you know, living in the diaspora, or you're a slave, well, you know, the health, wealth, and worldly success that the gods were supposed to give you, that ain't happening. So now you've got this Paul guy showing up and he's telling you, no, you have value and you can understand stuff about God that these rich people can't. You're going to be like, yo, sign me up. That sounds good. That sounds interesting. You know, and I think that when we're talking about, you know, why is religion? Why are people religious? You know, it's worth thinking about the fact that in a lot of times, in a lot of places, religion fulfills some really basic human needs. And although, and that's all I really have to say, although I do have to say that whoever boasts should boast in the Lord is just the biggest humble brag in the history of the world. Because that's like Paul saying, oh no, it's not about me, it's not about me, it's about God.
I feel like you've heard that at church before.
Yes. Did I mention that I was on the road to Damascus and Jesus talked to me? Aren't I great? I'm the Apostle Paul, but I'm not boasting. I'm just telling you what God has done in my life.
I mean,
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that, you know, people who do that might be annoying, but they're at least operating in a proud Christian tradition.
It's biblical.
It's biblical.
Scriptural.
Scriptural. Okay. Did anybody else have anything to say?
Well, just a comment on Matthew, where on the one hand, this Sermon on the Mount is trying to, to imitate or perhaps even to improve on the image of Moses receiving the law at Mount Sinai. But now it is whereas in the Exodus narrative, it is God who is speaking these words to the Israelites. Here it is Jesus, let's say, like somewhat like expanding on the words that were given at Sinai. So it's like a second revelation coming from the Messiah himself.
Right. And that's worth pointing out, and that's a really important thing to bring out, because that's kind of this constant theme that's running through in Matthew, is that Jesus is the new Moses. And what Jesus is doing is not eliminating the old covenant, but he's expanding upon it, and he's making it better. Right?
Right.
And I think that is, and one thing that I think I would like to bring, that I'd like to mention, that I found in a lot of the readings, is that some scholars will connect that to this kind of weird image we have of salt that's lost its saltiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one that I want to take a minute to unpack, because to try to figure this out, I actually read this book that's just called Salt.
Oh, it's an excellent book. Kurlansky?
Yeah. It's a really good book. And anyway, it's literally this micro history of salt, like the food that you eat, right? Because I was trying to figure out, how can salt become less salty, right? Well, it turns out that what's going on with that is that the salt that would have been used in the first century would have come from natural evaporation, either at the Dead Sea or on the sea coastline. And that salt has, okay, when we say salt, we mean sodium chloride. So Amanda, can you explain what a salt is? Because it's not just sodium chloride.
The most basic definition of salt is a ionic compound that completely dissolves in water. Dissociates in water. So basically anything in that first column of the periodic table and the next to last periodic table will form a salt. Now there are extra salts, there's other things, but those are the primary sources of salts.
Right.
That's the most basic, easy explanation. There's more to it, but that's the easiest one.
So what that means is that you take, say, like seawater, right, and evaporate it, and there's going to be a lot of sodium chloride in there, but there's going to be like potassium chloride and a whole bunch of different chlorides. And all of those will taste more or less salty to the human tongue. But if you don't have, but that means that if, say, I'm a, first century Judean, and I've gotten a bag of salt, that as I'm going through the bag and the different salts will sort of settle out, by the time you get to the bottom, you're going to get something that may or may not taste very much like salt. Now, one of the ways that you can deal with that problem is you can dissolve it in water and let it re-evaporate, and that will collect up the sodium chloride. So you basically re-refine your salt, and that's something that even in the Middle Ages, and actually even in the 18th century, you actually have books, you have household manuals will give people advice on how to basically re-purify your salt. And also with sugar the same way, because you'll get stuff that has a lot of contaminants in it, and you do the final refining process at home. So this is one of those things where what at the time would have been kind of strange, but if you think about it for a minute, it's just like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. To us is completely incomprehensible. And that's why Nerd Church exists, because we have people who will read the book on salt to figure this out for you. So, and this isn't just trivia, because it kind of relates to how Matthew is thinking about this whole process, right? Because like Aldo said, this Sermon on the Mount is the same, is parallel to Moses's thing on Mount Sinai. So the idea is that you got the salt on Mount Sinai, right? But over time, it's become contaminated. It's had, crap fell into the jar, whatever. So we need to purify it. And then what's left is going to be salt. Which, and I bring this up because a lot of people kind of get really hung up on the whole, cast aside and trampled underfoot thing. Because, there's a very strong, wrath of God. If you don't follow the rules, God will, cast you aside and trample you underfoot. And instead, what this is raising is the possibility that instead of getting cast aside and trampled underfoot, that what God really wants is purification. Which, is I think kind of a more positive message. Now, of course, that, takes us to the second question, which is, okay, this is a positive message. How much of this is the authentic words of Jesus, and how much of this is stuff that the author of Matthew just made up? Because there is, of course, a version of this sermon in Luke, except that in Luke, this sermon happens famously, it's the Sermon on the Plain, as opposed to the Sermon on the Mount. Which suggests that this is probably something that was come up with later, because which of course doesn't necessarily mean, oh, this is fiction in the sense of this is made up. It's more like this is fiction in the sense that if I wanted to imagine my, like, well, if I wanted to imagine like a conversation with my grandma, right? And I'm like writing down kind of all the things that my grandma like used to say to me about her general life advice. And I'm putting it all into one conversation. Well, that conversation never happened, but she actually said all that stuff, right? It's just that you're arranging it for dramatic effect into this nice little memorable passage so that you can just remember, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So which I bring up because that's one thing that happens in scholarship, is that there has to be this effort to always figure out, like, okay, this is a literary creation, and how much of this is the literary creation and how much of this is what actually happened.
Mm.
Because of course the easy answer is to just say, well, this is a literary creation, so it's all crap, right? Which I think is what a lot of people think that critical scholars do, when in fact critical scholars are a lot smarter about that. They go, okay, it's a literary creation, but where's the there? And a really interesting, and I've mentioned the five gospels before, and I just want to hold this up to the screen. This is their system on Matthew 5. So the black parts are parts that they don't think that Jesus actually said. And then as we are heading towards red, that shows what they think that Jesus probably actually said. So, for example, they are like, say, 90% positive that Jesus probably said something like, blessed are this poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, who they will be comforted. But then for some reason, they are less confident about Jesus having said, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And I couldn't, and then basically they're saying the Jesus Seminars argument for why the stuff that's relating to persecution is a later interpolation, is they think that got added to Matthew in the early, after the destruction of the in the like late first, early second century, when there were actually starting to be persecutions of Christians, that so you have this persecuted Christian community who needed comfort, and that's when the persecution language gets started. There are other scholars who assume that, a colonized Jewish people are going to also be receptive to blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And that there's good reason to think that this whole thing probably reflects the authentic teachings of Jesus to some degree. I personally think that it's more likely that most of these sayings probably existed in either a written or an oral tradition that went back to Jesus, or at least that the author of Matthew thought went back to Jesus, rather than, I'm less confident that you can kind of go through and cherry pick, like, this beatitude is authentic, this beatitude isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why blessed are the meek would be any less, likely than the other ones. That doesn't,
Yeah.
like, the persecution being added later as like a continuation of the thought later. I could see the argument there. Like, I'm not, I don't know enough to like say yes or no, but I can see where the point comes from. But the meek, and maybe that's because I'm tired of hearing how badly it's interpreted, and so I'm not willing to let go of it. Because white men are so bad at interpreting "Blessed are the meek." Because if I have to hear one more time about the stupid horse and it being under control, I'm gonna lose my mind.
Yeah.
I'm going to lose my
Well,
mind.
yeah.
I'm
Well,
gonna I'm gonna probably like shout in church.
yeah.
And I'm not a shout in church kind of person. I'm a quiet in church kind of person, and it might make me shout. 'Cause
Mhm. Well, and I think that and the other reason why I'm more willing to why I'm more willing to buy the maximalist explanation is a lot of times scholars, when they're like, okay, we think that this is an interpolation and this is not, is they'll have like really tight arguments that kind of go around like this particular Greek word is not used elsewhere in Matthew kinds of things. And at least from what I can find, the argument isn't based on that kind of logic. It has more to do with like, does that particular scholar think that Jesus was talking about this particular set of themes?
mm,
Um, and I think that that is a harder thing to argue because ultimately what you're doing is kind of you're saying my headcanon version of Jesus would say this or not say this,
mhm.
right? Well, I mean, I can only be responsible for my own headcanon version of Jesus.
Right.
Um, but I think that, it like there's a reason why Christianity tends to embrace the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain or whatever you want to call it as like headcanon Jesus, right? It's like the Beatitudes are kind of the most Jesus that Jesus sounds like, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. But I mean, it's remarkable to me how badly it's interpreted.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, just like in the sense that like we a way I have seen it interpreted so many times that makes my blood just boil. Um, is is speaking from a very American point of view, American like white man point of view, and trying to soften like how extreme some of it is.
yeah,
Like, oh, the poor in spirit, that's not really the poor.
yeah.
It's the ones who are sad. And you're like, that's the mourn, but okay. Or the
Well,
meek
and
is like a horse. It's actually a horse that's like well under control and not just like someone who doesn't have any power.
yeah.
Because being able to put your because that means not them. Um so I think
Well, and I will say, and I do have to quote my priest's sermon on this because because his run at the poor in spirit was really good. And I have to say this is actually the first good take on the poor in spirit that I have ever heard come out of a white man's mouth. So I'm going to repeat it, which is that basically being poor in spirit means being completely detached from from your material possessions, right? To the
Mhm.
point that like your walking down the street and you see someone who needs a coat, right? Well, you just take your coat off and give it to him, right? And even, and this could be like, a really expensive designer coat, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. You see a cold person, you take it off, you give it to them, right? And that's being poor in spirit, is to not is to just accept whatever your material circumstances are, as long as you have sort of what you need to survive on a daily basis.
An open hand, essentially.
Right, exactly. And yes, you enjoy, like you enjoy having a nice meal, you enjoy having a comfortable house, you enjoy whatever you have, but you're not attached to it. And as long as you have enough, then anything extra you have, you can just give away without diminishing yourself. And I thought that was just the like an actual good take on that passage.
That is a much more applicable way to put it, because I'm sure, I mean, to some of the people who've read that passage are like, oh, that's me because I got nothing.
Yeah.
And
Well,
and in the kingdom of heaven I will have something, and that's I will have all my needs met. But in a world where many of us have so many of our needs met and so many of our wants met, to say that being poor in spirit is being the conduit for these things to meet other people's needs is I think that's A plus.
well, and I think that is kind of the struggle of modern Christianity in general, is that you've taken, I mean, I quoted, I mentioned that famous quotation before, but like Christianity in a lot of ways is built to be a religion for women and slaves, and whether we're looking at the Old Testament or the New Testament, we're also talking about books that were written to give people comfort and hope when their country was being occupied by an empire, or was at constant threat of being occupied by an empire again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you have this religion that like just baked into the texts is this like opposition to empire, and this need to give comfort to the oppressed. And when you're not personally oppressed, that it's like it's not quite talking to you, right? So you either have to do what Amanda was alluding to and deform the text so that this becomes a defensive empire, right? So it's not saying to someone who is, who's meek, you know, you're meek because you can't talk back, right? Your voice has been taken to you. All you can do is obey, but in the end, you're going to inherit the kingdom. So just bite your tongue. God gets it. Jesus understands it's going to be okay, right? Instead, that gets turned into a club to tell people, sit down, shut up, keep sweet, smile, because you look prettier when you smile. and and eventually you'll be okay. As the folk singer Arlo Guthrie, or not Arlo, Woody Guthrie put it, they promise you pie in the sky when you die, right? So that
Mhm.
so that the Sermon on the Mount becomes a way of getting people to accept their own oppression,
Mhm.
as opposed to telling them how to cope with it psychologically.
So a wonderful text, if you wanted a book suggestion. Uh, Howard Thurman, who was a early civil rights leader in Black civil rights leader in the States, wrote in 1949, Jesus and the Disinherited. And it is an incredible interpretation of the Gospels as basically dignity to the undignified, like the people who are had their dignity removed from them, and it is a reclamation of that dignity as a human being. So suggestion if you're interested. It's a really good book.
Yeah. There's another, if you're interested in a more kind of historic view on that, there's a really good book called From Shame to Sin, which is about the evolution of ideas about basically the meaning of having engaged in premarital sexual activity for women, particularly if that activity basically in kind of the first in kind of the late classical antiquity, so like basically the second to about the 5th century. I don't remember the exact dates. It's been a while since I've read the book, but it's basically talking about how part of the appeal of Christianity was that it introduced this element of consent, so that it was saying that if you are a slave woman in the Roman Empire and your owner is doing horrible things to you, that doesn't diminish your value, because you didn't sin, or this is how you can avoid sinning, and this is how you can be purified of that sin, even if you somehow feel somewhat culpable. And I think that and obviously that's why in Christianity, and particularly in Catholicism, there are that I think is where monasticism comes from, right? Or when Pope Francis gets up there and says, we need a poor church for the poor, that's what that's saying, is that you have to basically, if the gospel isn't written for you, you either have to try to emulate the people that the gospel was written for, or you're going to end up deforming the gospel. And using blessed are the merciful as a cudgel to try to force people to publicly forgive the people who have harmed them, even though the people who have harmed them have not done anything to make reparation.
All right, you know what? I have been had this book recommended before. I've seen this cover. I just have never read it yet.
Which book?
This From Shame to Sin.
Okay,
I had to Google it. You know, I have a thing about having too many books, okay? Like too many books. It's a problem. They don't all fit on the shelf.
Yeah. Well, anyway, So the point is that once again we see that everybody agrees that that in the New Testament Jesus is 100% not a fan of empire. And I think that in the world we can kind of look around and see maybe why empire isn't a good idea.
Oh. Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So on that note, that's all I have to say for today. Um, I don't know if anybody else had anything to say in closing.
Oh, I
No,
did have the thought earlier about because the even because everybody matters. I think right now that is something we need to hear because a lot of us are feeling really powerless, and because every one of us matters. Even small actions on our part are important in um, reaching towards justice and kindness and mercy in this world because God knows we need more of it right now, more than it feels like than ever. Um, so that just do something. It's okay. You can do something. It doesn't have to be everything because you can. Because
Yep.
I'm seeing a lot of anxiety about that.
Yep. Oh, and I just realized that all the stuff that I was nattering on about the salt of the earth is actually in Matthew 13, which we're reading next week.
I was wondering where the salt had come from, but I was letting you cook.
Yeah, I know. I was just when I was doing my research, everything I was finding was treating the Sermon on the Mount as like one whole thing,
Oh,
and not and somehow it didn't. I just didn't. Yeah. Anyway, my brain is weird. But anyway, so yeah, come back next week and we'll have Isaiah, more of First Corinthians. Yeah, so
I
if
love First Corinthians. I don't know. I'm
yeah,
shameless.
yeah, we are getting plenty of time with First Corinthians, and then Matthew 5, which will be a lot shorter because I can just say, yeah, go back and watch last week's episode and I will talk all about the salt. Anyway, so I just want to um, thank everyone for being here again, and everybody have a great day. And we'll see you on Thursday at 5:30 Eastern when we will continue to explain why John Yep and retired Bishop Strickland really need to think about their lives and their choices, and have a great week, everyone.